Hello. A number of you seem to be having trouble with the citation part of the research process. So I wanted to do this video to walk you through that a little bit and show you where the resources are on the blog. If you have more questions, I'll be happy to answer. If you have general questions, you could shoot them to me in email or uh, I'll be looking obviously at your citations as I look at your argument papers and your text wrestling for that matter. Okay, so on the blog, the main couple things that you want to look at on this research, under this research tab, under stages of the process, um, we had this one about finding and evaluating sources, and then down at the bottom, the two about this one I just added. I thought I had that on um, before, but there's a page here about identifying types of sources. Actually, I linked to a little tutorial on Noodle Tools, which is a citation machine. One of the important things you need to do in order to be able to cite a source is to know what type of source it is. So this has some of the more common types of sources, and you can um, click in each of them and it'll give you some little tips about how you can tell one from the other. Um, okay, so backing up a little bit, citation involves two main pieces. The two types of citation that you need, and this again, stage of the process, citation, how and why, explains the two parts. There's some information here about why we cite. In part, it is, it helps to protect you against charges of plagiarism. But there are also some ethical reasons why citation is important in the academic world. It's really important in academic world to acknowledge your sources as you're writing. You're entering into a conversation with other people. You're responding to what other people have said. And so it's important to acknowledge who those people are, just on an ethical level. Also, when you think about your readers, if you've taken a quote out of something or paraphrase something, your reader may be curious about to get more information about the context of that quote, or to check to make sure you're accurate in paraphrasing things, or just to get more information. So they may want to go back and look at that source. So in citing your sources, you're enabling your reader to consult the sources that you've used to get additional information. It also improves your own credibility. If you just make a claim off the top of your head without anything to back you up, um, you know, your reader may wonder if you know what you're talking about. If you use a source, and if this looks like a credible source is coming from an authoritative site, that helps to make your argument or your point more believable. If you can, if you cite a population statistic, or um, make some kind of factual claim and you don't have anything to back it up, um, your reader can jump in and question what you're talking about. So the sources are important there as well. Um, there are two, and there's some other general information here about sources. So the two pieces of citation are in-text citation and constructing a works cited page. The in-text citation is where, as you're writing your paper, when you use the information from sources, whether you're quoting it directly word for word, or taking an idea or summarizing a larger chunk into your couple sentences, or maybe more, in any of those cases, you need to acknowledge what that source was in your text as you're writing along. So um, here's an example of an indirect citation. I'll talk about that in a minute. Um, the in-text citation basically is a kind of a tag. It's in the form of parentheses um, that come right after the bit of information that you've taken from your source. Um, what's in the parentheses can vary depending on what the um, bibliographic entry for the source looks like. But basically, a rule that'll get you by most of the time not in this situation, but most of the time, is that in these in-text citations, you would include, if it's an electronic source, which most of sources are, just the last name of the author of the source. If the source doesn't have an author, which may be a credibility issue, because if it doesn't have an author, we want to make sure that whoever's written this source knows what they're talking about, and it's a little harder. But if you get a site on the CDC or some governmental site or whatever, oftentimes there's staff writers that are compiling that information, and they may not be able to put their name on the source, but it's still, the source looks credible. So it'd be the author's last name if there's is an author for the source. If there isn't an author for the source, normally what you're going to use is the title of the article or the title of the web page that you've used. That title will be in parentheses, and then within the parentheses you'll have quotation marks and then the title. If the title is very long, you're allowed to shorten it, as long as when your reader looks at your list of works cited, they can tell what source you're referring to. I want to skip over this in-text citation for a minute and talk some about your works cited page, because really, if you do your works cited page first, it's easier to see the format of this in-text citation. So there's no reason, once you've done your research and decided which sources you're going to use, I think it's a good idea just to do your works cited page at that point rather than wait until the end of the process, because as I say, as you're using this information within your writing, as you're writing along, you want to know what format to use. And if you have the works cited page already done, it's easier to see the format for the in-text citation. Okay, so how to do a works cited page. There are some resources here. I'll walk you through a few of them. There also are some links here to some automatic citation machines, and I'll show you how that works briefly. This is the quickest source. It is a source that our Writing Center has put together. It's one of their popular handouts. It's just a one sheet, two front and back, that you can access. On the front page here, it tells you about in-text citations, situations where the author's not given or the author is given in the text. If the author is unknown, that's the situation I told you where you're going to use the title of the web page or the article. And that's indirect sources. That's the situation that was back on the sheet where you saw that quoted in Hayward. I'll go ahead and talk about in-text citation a little bit here, I guess. So here, if the author's name isn't given in the text, what you have is the author's last name in the citation here. This number here is a page number. This implies that the source was a paper-based source, not something that you found online. If you find some sources online, you are not required to give a page number, because the page numbers will depend on, if you print something out, the magnification of the screen. So it's not a definite page number. The other thing is, if you have an electronic source, it's possible to find a quote using a Control F. If you were on the page and did Control F, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but you can find things electronically with the Control F. So you do a Control F, and you could use a cultural expectations here, and that would find the times when cultural expectations were used on that page. So the page number is not necessary to find the quote the same way it would be, page number would be necessary if you had a book and you were trying to find where the quote or where the information was. If the author's name is given in the text, it's not necessary to use the author's name here. It's not wrong exactly, but it's not necessary. What these in-text citations are doing is giving just a little bit of information, and then that allows the reader to go to your works cited page, find the source, Hayward, and then get the rest of the information: the title, the publisher, the city of publication, the date. Depends on what type of source you have, what kind of information you'll have. So this is the unknown author with the title instead of the author. This indirect sources, this is a case situation which may seem a little unusual, but it actually crops up fairly often in English 101. This is a situation where the author of your source has quoted other people. Um, that happens a lot in academic writing. It also happens a lot in journalism, where the author of the source is a journalist, not necessarily an expert in the field, not usually not an expert in the field. So the journalist would go out and interview other people, and if those people had important things to say, he may well quote them. The problem in doing that is if you had just used Hayward's name, Hayward wrote the source, and had a quote here, it gives them the mistaken idea that Hayward actually made the quotation, said the quotation, which he didn't. Hayward interviewed or used another source, in this case, this guy Worf. So just Hayward here would be misleading. If you used Worf here, because Worf said the quote, the problem is when you look at the Works Cited page, Worf isn't one of your sources because he wasn't the author of your source. So your reader wouldn't know what source you were talking about. So in this case, the way you get around that is you use the author of the quote. You have to use in the sentence. And then in the in-text citation, you use this abbreviation in MLA. This is the form you use, QTD period, which stands for quoted in Hayward. And then again, this is a paper source, presumably, so it has a page number. That illustrates another point, which I've been making some comments on people's papers, and that's the issue of dropped-in quotes. Um, Whenever you're using a quote from a source, you don't want to just finish your sentence and have a period and then start a quote immediately. Um, that is the same situation. Again, I've been writing this on some people's papers. That's the situation as if, imagine you're on stage talking, and then all of a sudden somebody rushes on stage, grabs the microphone out of your hand. Your reader has no idea who they are and what they're there for. So what you want to use is some sort of wording of your own to introduce the quote. Often that'll it may give the author's name. Sometimes it'll say something like, according to one researcher in the field, blah blah blah, or recent studies have shown that, blah blah blah, and then start your quote. But something that kind of introduces the quote, sometimes gives an attribution, that is, says where the quote comes from, and also sometimes you want some sense of how this quote connects to what you just said. So some kind of meaning connection, logical connection between them. That's a situation when you're using quotes. When you're paraphrasing, that doesn't arise because you're in your words anyway. Okay, so that's the in-text citation part. So it's really an issue, and one thing I tried to emphasize when I was talking about taking notes. When you're doing, especially when you're doing a large research project, it's really important as you're using information from each of your sources to track where it comes from, so that when you're writing your paper, you'll be able to put in that in-text citation. I've had students in the past who write a whole research paper and use information from a variety of sources but don't have any in-text citations. If they have to take that draft and go back and figure out which source came, which quote, which information came from which source, that really is a pain in the neck. It takes you a lot of time, and if you had kept track through the note-taking process of where these bits of information came from, then you can just use your notes. The information is there, and you don't have to go back and hunt through all of your sources. So I strongly encourage, as moving forward as you're doing research, strongly encourage you to do that. And you can do it just by as you're taking notes, put numbers on all of your sources, and then with your notes, put that number in, and then you can get the in-text citation in the proper format later on. That's not so hard a task if you know which source it is, and you don't have to flip through all these pages. Okay, so next is constructing a works cited. So this is the second page here. What they've done here is taken some of the more common types of sources and done models. This works cited as a whole is formatted more or less pretty much the way a works cited would be in a paper. with a couple exceptions. Your Works Cited will start a new page. That's not an issue on the blog, but if you're doing paper uh, versions of things or Word files for people down the line, or when you turn in a final draft to me that's in a paper format, your Works Cited should start a new page. Um, it says Works Cited, cited with a C. The bold is not accurate. It should just be regular Times New Roman, regular font, regular weight type. Um, the sources are alphabetized by whatever comes first. So normally it's the author's last name. In some cases, it's if there isn't an author, it's a title. I think this movie is the only one that here that has that. And then it's formatted in a style called a hanging indent. Each of the entries starts on the left. If there's any carryover lines, second or third lines, they're indented, a paragraph indent. You can do that in Word if you get into a paragraph format window, which will let you set line spacing. It also will let you, there's a, in the middle of that, um, uh, here, let me open up Word and I'll show you. Okay, now I'm working on a Mac, and you may not have the same format of Word that I do. Um, let's see, where is it? Uh, and, not sure where it went to here. This is a problem with Word. It changes its, oh, I know, format here, paragraph format. Um, Again, depending on your version of Word, you might have to search around to find this pop-up window, but it's someplace. So you can set line spacing here. It should be double spaced as the rest of your text would be, and then what you'll do once you get your Works Cited, imagine I had a bunch of entries typed on this page. This special lets you do hanging indent. You can click hanging and notice how, in this sample how it shoves everything over, and then you do OK. So that's the hanging indent in Word. On the blog, don't worry about it. The readers will know that you can't really can't very easily anyway replicate that format on the blog, and so I wouldn't worry about it. So the other thing about this is, again, if you were in a paper format, this would be double spaced throughout, with no extra space between the lines. Okay, so if you wanted to use this to do a Works Cited, you would have to identify the type of source that you had. Which in the old days was simple. You had a book or a newspaper or a magazine or a journal. These days it's a little more complex, and on the screen it's difficult sometimes for students to tell exactly what they have. So you have to, be careful to look at the name of the website and try to figure out what this site is. It may be a website, but just because it's online, it doesn't necessarily mean it's web-based. So you may be on the website of a newspaper, so that an article that you get is something that was a newspaper article rather than a website. And then you need to be able to distinguish between newspapers and magazines. Magazines are periodicals that are issued on a regular schedule, but the word magazine implies that it's a general interest sort of thing. The New Yorker, Atlantic Monthly, Wired, those are all magazines. Journals implies that you have an academic journal. This often has a title such as Journal of Education, Journal of Abnormal Psychology, etc. If you look at it, the pages, if you get PDF pages, you'll see typically dense text. You'll see academic credentials for the authors. You may see abstracts. You'll see Works Cited at the end of or reference lists at the end of the article. You'll see a minimum of advertising. Those would all be signs of an academic journal. Often they're numbered with a volume and number system, which is what these two numbers represent. Okay, so you look at the source that you were going to use. You'd figure out what type of source you have. Not every type is listed along here. Um, the more common ones are, but there are other types that you may. And so I'll show you in a minute some places you could go if you can't find the type of source. The other issue here is that it doesn't explain what all these different things are. Sometimes it's fairly obvious where you've got an author's name here, you've got the title of the article, you've got the title of the journal. But this 183.1, you might not know exactly what that refers to. So if you this is more helpful if you want a really quick check of something like what gets italicized, what kind of punctuation do you use, those kind of quick checks. What order do things appear in? One thing that I had to look up a lot of times until it finally sunk into my head is here. This is a book, so this is the author's last name, comma, first name. For the first author, if you have more than one author, the subsequent authors are in normal order, first name, middle name, last name. If you have four or more authors in MLA format, you're allowed to just put the first author's name and then the words et al, et space al period, which is Latin for and others. Um, then you have a period after the authors. The title of the book is in italics. These dates are part of the title. Then this is the I started to say I there are things that I have had to look up over and over again, uh, and that's the question. I know I wanted the place of publication and I need the publisher. I had a hard time remembering which comes first. It seems a little counterintuitive to me. I would assume the publisher would come first and then the place. I guess thinking of addresses, but the way MLA does it is the place of publication comes first, a colon, then the publisher, a comma, and then the copyright or print date, and then the word print. Um, so notice there are a lot of different pieces to this, a lot of things you have to watch out for. There's the order of information, the types of information that you need, what is regular type, what's italic, um, what punctuation are used, how do you capitalize things in titles in MLA. All of the important words are capitalized except for articles, a and the, conjunctions, and prepositions in. So we have article here, conjunction, preposition. Those are lowercase, but other words, pronouns, verbs, nouns are all capitalized, regardless of how they appear in the source. Another thing to notice is that we have print here. Notice in the different citations here, we have something that indicates the format of the source. So print implies that you actually had a print book or a print magazine article or an actual big newspaper that you were using. Um, Anything that you access through the computer, um, whether it's a newspaper article or a web page or a journal article or whatever, or getting into the databases, says web. And there are some other formats as well if you have videos or we've got CD here and film. Okay, that raises another side issue. This version, I've got some bad news. This version of MLA, unfortunately, is really, as of a couple weeks ago, outdated. MLA periodically issues revisions to its rules, and it just issued a new one a couple weeks ago. The reference sources online haven't had a chance, for the most part, to catch up to that. And because it's happening in the middle of the semester, near the end of the semester, which is not good timing, and as far as I'm concerned, we're going to stick with this version, which is MLA 7. But MLA 8 is out, and as you go forth next semester into other classes where you may be using MLA, there are some differences. And one of them is that this bit of formatting is no longer used. I'm still not quite up to date on all the changes that they've made, but These citation formats are an evolving kind of process as the different organizations that have citation systems sort of become more accustomed to this online research process. They're simplifying and sort of changing their minds a little bit about what's actually necessary to put. So uh, just keep an eye out. Again, if you're using MLA citation in the future, you will be operating under slightly different rules, and you'll want to be sure to check an instructor in a class over the summer, particularly, but also next fall to make sure the instructor, him or herself, is acquainted with this, and find out whether they want you to use MLA 7, which this represents the 7th edition, or MLA 8, which will be the one in force um, shortly, so as soon as we all become accustomed to it. Okay, so let's see. Book here, I would say book. It's a basic type of source. Not that many students are using them these days, unfortunately. They are reputable, of course. Credibility issues are at a minimum with books, especially if you're using books that are accessible from an academic library. Um, so the books have gone through several layers of vetting, both in the editorial process and in the library selection. Journal article in a database should be a very common form, especially as you go forward into upper level courses where the databases really are your go-to source for resources. So I hope you've all had a chance to get into the databases. I had done a video about that. If you missed that, go back and look over that. It's in the on the page about finding and evaluating sources, I believe. Newspaper be a fairly common source. This is a print source, so if you found a newspaper article online, you would have web. One thing I'll mention about web sources and another point about dates. Web sources typically would have, let's find look at this web page. A web source typically will have 2 dates on it. This first date here is the date that the site was, that the page was posted, or if there's a more recent update date, it would be that date. You can find these usually at the top of the page or at the bottom of the page. Sometimes the update dates will be at the bottom. Um, Couple things. MLA date formats are in day, month, year. This actually, unfortunately, is a mistake here. March should be abbreviated MAR period. I think there's another example on here somewhere where the March is done properly. The dates, again, the dates, that's something I looked up a ton of times till it finally sunk in. May, June, and July are spelled out in full. The other months are abbreviated, generally 3-letter abbreviations, MAR period here, except for September, which is SEPT. So Jan, Feb, Mar, APR, then AUG for August, SEPT, OCT, NOV, DEC, period. So day, month, year. Then the word web for the format. Then you have a second date here, which is the access date. For online sources, it's because the internet changes over time. It's important to mention when you got this information, because when your reader goes back some years later and looks for this source, it may not be there, or it may not be in that format. So this sort of covers you in the sense that you're saying this is the source as I saw it on May 15th, 2008. It might be possible for the reader to get cached versions of the page if they wanted to see what you saw. Okay, the other thing I'll mention here, since we're here on this web page, we've got these. So this is the author's name, last name, comma, first name, period. This is the title of the web page. So that's the thing that you could scroll through. This is the website. That typically would be, it's CNN.com, not because it would say CNN.com up here in the address bar, but because this implies that it actually said CNN.com on the page itself. Typically that that would be up in the upper left-hand corner. It's sometimes a little hard to tell the difference between the web site and the sometimes there's a site within a site, so it can get complicated with electronic sources. There isn't always one right way that everybody would agree on. So there are some kind of judgment calls that you'll have to make as you do citation. But this is the name of the website. So this is the web page, period here, the quotations around it. The website name gets italicized. This cable news network is down as the publisher. Normally you can find the publisher if you go to the bottom of the page. There'll be a copyright statement, and whoever holds the copyright is generally considered the publisher. So it would have been spelled out Cable News Network. Sometimes the name of the website, and the publisher are the same, in which case you'd repeat them. The first italicized as the website, and then the publisher is in regular type. Okay, so this raises, as talking through this, you can see that there are some issues in using this, especially if you don't have a good familiarity with what some of these things are. Here, I mentioned this is the volume number and the number. Well, it doesn't doesn't say that. It doesn't use VOL or NO for volume and number, so somebody might not know what these numbers represent. So if you need more information than this quick guide gives you, there are a couple other sites. The Purdue Online Writing Lab is a standard that writing teachers often refer their students to. This orange site, and they have navigation down the side here. Notice it does acknowledge here that MLA has recently released the 8th edition, and there's a little summary of changes here. And as they say, they'll be replacing this site with more up-to-date version as of June of this year. So that's coming. But for right now, this links to MLA 7. So there's some basics about in-text citation here. You could click on the Works Cited page are in these five, I think it was, pages here. This on basic format, books, periodicals, electronic sources, and other sources. So if you just look at electronic sources here, this has a basic format, basic style with the information that you'd use. And then it has all these different types of sources and situations, whether you want to cite an entire website. And here, see, it does have the examples down here, but it also has the generalized version, so you can identify what the different fields here are in the citation. Page on a website, an image, article in a web magazine, online scholarly journal, etc. One thing with this online scholarly journal, often these are accessed through the databases, and one thing I would remind people is that the databases generally do your citation for you. So if you're using database sources, be sure to look over there on the right side to get your citation. If you have questions about that, I can let me know, and I'll do another little quick thing about database use. Well, here's from a database. Email, blog post, tweet, etc. So that's one source if you have additional questions. There's another one here. Norton has put online a number. See, this is 50 pages. This is like a chunk out of a handbook. I'm not sure if this is an actual handbook or what it is, but this, you can look at I'll slow down here so you won't get dizzy. This has the information about the in-text documentation, and then works cited, books, periodicals, electronic sources. So the same kind of breakdown that the Purdue OWL does, and other types of sources. So you can look at the two of them and see which you think is more, which seems more user-friendly to you. There also is a sample research paper, so you can see what it looks like all all put together. Um, okay, so let me get back to this. I just okay. So getting circling back to this in-text citation. So if you do the works cited first, then the in-text citation, and this is sort of a basic principle to keep in mind. Sometimes it's rather than memorize something exactly, it's more helpful to sort of understand the principles behind it. So with the in-text citation, what you're giving in the in-text citation, that is where you're tagging, the actual information that you use. What you give is the first element in the works cited. So that's why it's normally an author's last name. Or if there wasn't an author, say here, it would have started with the title. So the title would be the first thing. So that's that idea of it's the author's last name or the title. Because notice this works cited is alphabetized. That's going to be the easiest way for your reader to find the source. If they go to this works cited, it's alphabetized. It's just like a dictionary. So you know how quick it is to, imagine a dictionary if the words were all scrambled. You'd be lucky if you ever stumbled across the entry. Works cited pages, in theory, if you're talking about a book, could be pages long. A 20-page long works cited, you know, might be possible in some academic book. So if you use in your in-text citation an article in Kansas Quarterly said blah de blah, well, if your reader's trying to find that, if Kansas Quarterly is in the middle here, they're going to have to read through everything to find the Kansas Quarterly. And suppose you had more than one Kansas Quarterly, it would take forever to find, and they might not be sure at that point. Whereas if you pick this first element and use that in your in-text citation, it's quick to find it, just like finding a word in a dictionary, because of the fact that the works cited is alphabetized. So that helps you, if you think about how the in-text citation is working together with the works cited, that will help you remember a couple things. One, to hopefully to alphabetize your works cited. Again, imagining a longer works cited page and how would your reader find the source. And the other is to think about what belongs in the in-text citation, that you want your reader to be able to quickly go from your in-text citation to this works cited and actually be able to find it. It also raises issues that may crop up if you're doing a more, it's possible it's going to crop up with your short research papers in English 101, but more likely if for a longer paper. This doesn't cover all of the situations. Suppose you have two sources by this Greeley, or two different Greeleys, and you've just got Greeley as the last name. So what you need to be able to do is think from your reader's perspective. If it just said Greeley here, and there were two Greeleys, the reader wouldn't know what source it was. So there are some more rare circumstances here where you have two authors with the same last name, or two sources by the same author. So you would have to put some additional information to specifically identify the source. And it's not important to remember, all the different kinds of exceptions there might be, but what you need to be able to do is think through, okay, I've got Hayward here. When I look down here, there are two Haywards, so I have to do something. I have to figure out how to handle this situation, because my reader doesn't know what source it is. So that would be a reason to go back to one of those guides, and it explains what you need to do. If there are two different Haywards with two different first names, you also add in the first name here. If they're two sources by the same person, you would have to add in you would have Hayward plus the title that you'd include. So again, but the situation is, what you need to do is try to see how this would work. If there are any kind of unusual circumstances, you need to go back to a reference and find out how to handle it. You don't need to memorize all this stuff, especially with this, new MLA citation coming up. Okay. There may be some other research related things that come up as I look at your arguments. But I think that's it for now. So let me know if you have any questions. I'm gonna save this and post it. I'm hoping to see um, argumentative drafts as soon as possible. Hopefully this weekend, so that I can get some feedback on them later today. All right. Good luck. Let me know. Holler if you have questions.